Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our press conference to address our ongoing repatriation efforts on the University of North Dakota campus and our partnerships with the tribal representatives from across the region to do this important work. My name is David Dodds, and I am the Communication Director at the University of North Dakota. I am joined today on the panel by UND President Andrew Armacost, who will lead the university's responses today. He is joined on the panel by Nathan Davis, Executive Director of the North Dakota Indian Affairs Commission, and UND Professor Doug McDonald and Lane Lyons, both of whom are members of our UND Repatriation Committee. Just a quick note that we are recording the press conference so it can be shared afterward. Before we get to media questions, I would first like to turn it over to opening remarks from our panelists. President Armacost.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Armacost, and I'm the president of the University of North Dakota. As Dave Dodds just mentioned, I'm joined by Lane Lyons, Doug McDonald, and Nathan Davis. And I appreciate their contributions to the information that we're going to share today. I must begin my remarks by offering my respect to Native American communities and Indigenous people throughout North America. The information I'm sharing today must begin with my apologies to them, and also to stress our commitment to the work that I'm about to describe and see it through until its very end. Work began at UND last November to develop campus policies on the process of returning Native American artifacts to tribal lands. This is a process known as repatriation. We began with the formation of a committee, which comprised both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. I'm extraordinarily proud of the work that this committee has done over many months. And in a moment, you will hear a firsthand account of one committee member, Lane Lyons. In late February, members of the committee began searching for a missing sacred item on our campus. That search led to the discovery of a significant number of artifacts, most notably ancestral remains, which by culture and custom are known to be ancestors. Even a single bone or a bone fragment from a human being is known to be an ancestor. Since that discovery, we have been working with representatives from tribes in the region to seek their advice and their counsel, and to begin the early steps in the process of repatriation. We reached out by phone and in person. Their recent visit to our campus included blessing of spaces where ancestors and sacred items were stored, and the single location where the arduous work of developing a complete understanding of what we have here at UND will happen. The response of each tribal representative has been common: anger, sadness, acceptance of our apologies, and appreciation that we are involving them from the outset of this work. We will continue this spirit of partnership throughout our repatriation activities. We hope that this model of tribal partnership and involvement at the very beginning of repatriation can serve as a model for other universities and museums across North America. This work will attempt to connect ancestors and artifacts with their place of origin, and we will hire the appropriate experts to support us. When this is complete, the ancestors and sacred items will be returned in a manner consistent with the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA, involving federal agencies, state agencies, and most importantly, the tribal nations themselves. The number of ancestors that we have here currently on campus can be measured in the dozens. When we include other sacred artifacts, we have well over 250 boxes. Please know that our records for the ancestors and items in our possession are incomplete, and our work will connect them to the sites from where they were taken. Our initial impression is that some of the ancestors and funerary items were taken directly from sacred burial mounds. These excavations took place over the course of decades, from the 1940s and into the 1980s. We believe that repatriation activities did previously happen at UND, but how and why ancestors and sacred items remain on our campus is a mystery that we will have to answer in the course of our work. Our intent of sharing this news today is to apologize to tribal nations across North America, to avoid speculation about what's been happening on campus, and to offer our public commitment to those tribal nations and to the entire nation that we're going to return the ancestors and the artifacts to their homes. I have offered this commitment in the strongest possible terms to the council chairs of tribes associated with the state of North Dakota. The awareness of this work will allow us to have open conversations with the students, faculty, and staff at the University of North Dakota about the importance of repatriation and our commitment to see it through. Yesterday, we held 2 open sessions for our American Indian campus members. The first was with faculty and staff. The second was with students. Please know that this is an extraordinarily traumatic time for them. And we have resources on our campus and in place to support them as they struggle with this news. We will continue to partner with all tribes connected to these ancestors and sacred items. Undoubtedly, our connections will continue to grow as we learn more. And finally, let me touch on the issue of accountability. Our top priority currently is the return of ancestors and sacred items home to their tribal lands. Our knowledge of how this happened must include discussions with people involved in UND's archaeological research efforts in prior decades. Their accounts will be important as we piece together why this repatriation did not happen sooner, and also to address systemic issues at the university that led to where we are today. Please let me now introduce Lane Lyons to come forward for her comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lane Lyons. I am an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians located in Belcourt, North Dakota. I'm a director of development for the College of Arts and Sciences here at UND, and I'm also an alumni 2016 of the College of Arts and Sciences as well. Today, I'll be speaking on behalf of the NAGPRA Compliance Committee. This committee includes Doug McDonald, Keith Malater, Daniel Henry, Allison Kelleher, Donald Warren, Kyle Hill, Crystal Alberts, William Caraher, Sarah Heitkamp, Birgit Hans, Elizabeth Scharf, Kurt Hansen, Heather Wages, and myself. With their permission, I'll be speaking on the repatriation process we have started here at the University of North Dakota. On November 18th, 2021, I met Crystal Alberts to look at a collection that included headdresses or war bonnets, traditional dresses, moccasins, and other sacred items. These items were brought into a question through a partnership with a tribal entity. After establishing the wear and tear of these items, we began working on policies and taking a deeper dive into what UND had or owned, since it seemed that no one really knew what we had or how we got them. Fast forward to March 3rd, 2022. Sarah Heitkamp and her assistant and Crystal Alberts came across a ceremonial pipe in a space while documenting what they thought was anthropological artifacts. After stopping the documentation, Crystal called me to assist with cultural protocols. At that time, I didn't feel comfortable doing it by myself, so I made a phone call to Dr. Don Warren and Dr. Allison Kelleher to help assist as well. After our cultural protocols took place, we decided to take a look at another space. Between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, Don Warren, Allison Kelleher, Crystal Alberts, and myself discovered the first ancestor. Dr. Warren identified the box that contained the ancestor. I will never forget the look on his face, as it was the face of disappointment. In that moment, my heart sunk into my stomach. It was at that moment that I knew we were another institution that didn't do the right thing. Following the discovery, we informed other committee members at that time of the tragic news. Their hearts sunk to their stomachs as well. They felt betrayed, angry, sad, frustrated, and exhausted. All feelings and emotions that happen when grieving. I will never forget the look on their faces and the sound of their voices as well. During that same time, we informed the university administration of our findings. The same feelings were felt and expressed. It begs the questions: how did this happen? Who did this? Why did they do this? All questions we are seeking to know and looking to answer. As we move forward, President Armacost and myself and others starting having individual conversations with tribal representatives and state and federal agencies to discuss our findings. All who we spoke with were shocked, upset, angry, and devastated. Personally, these conversations were extremely difficult for me. They made me relive March 3rd every day, over and over. As we continued to search other areas, more and more ancestors began to be discovered. Each new one that was found felt like a deeper and deeper cut in our hearts. I want to make this clear. Through this process, it was important to our committee that we be transparent and open with our Indigenous communities. We have a strong and resilient Indigenous community amongst UND, students, staff, faculty, and alumni. We felt it was important to involve tribal representatives in the process instead of notifying them at the very end. We felt it was important to do this process in the most respectful way possible. The conversations I had just mentioned, although there was hurt, sadness, and anger, there was also appreciation. They appreciated the way that we were handling this and expressed that this was not the norm when dealing with situations like this. As we continue through this long and emotional work, we will continue to do this with the most respectful way possible. Being transparent, honest, and respectful will continue to guide this university. The committee, including myself, is proud of the work that we've done and the approach that we have taken. The representation of the committee and the guidance we have received is the reason we have done this process in a different way, and that's a good way. If there's any advice we could give on behalf of the committee, it would be for all institutions to look at their history and what they may have due to that history. This is a painful process for our Indigenous communities, but what is even more painful is to ignore or just pass off what you know or what you might find. In closing, I just would like to say that we are so grateful for the help, guidance, and trust that we have been given by so many. At this start of the process, we felt anger, hurt, sadness. However, we can now feel a sense of relief and hope because our ancestors will be returned to their rightful place, and that's home. We'll make sure of that. Thank you.
How kolowashtealo na buju niji michaje chetenglishka. I greet you in the language of my family of the Oglala Lakota people. Say hello to good friends and give my name, which was given to me when I was discharged from the U.S. Navy Spotted Hawk. I've been a professor at this university for going on 31 years now in the Department of Psychology and the director of the Indians into Psychology program. I arrived on this campus in the midst of the whole Fighting Sioux and logo situation, which even at that time, after 1992, certainly drug on for years. And I don't have to remind any that were here or that were even just remotely aware of that experience, that it left scars with relatives on both sides of the issue, and certainly in and amongst the UND American Indian community. I can speak with assurance that this has been harder. It's been tougher. I was also here in 1997 during the flood and directed the disaster mental health response during that time. And I remember something that one of the Red Cross mental health responders told me. She was very experienced, and she said, "Doug, a flood is different than any other type of natural disaster in the sense that it doesn't just happen immediately and then you start to deal with the aftermath." She said, it's a slow moving disaster. And those words have come back to me ever since I was notified of the situation with the ancestors back in February. This is a slow moving disaster for many of us, certainly those of us that are tasked with dealing with it. And for those of us that are tasked with dealing with it, those of us that have agreed to assume the responsibilities necessary, I'd like everyone to understand that none of us have been trained or are fully competent to do this work. I'm a psychologist, and albeit an American Indian psychologist, and that is my area of expertise that I bring to the committee. But there's no one on the committee that signed up for this by any means. And there's no one on this committee that knew anything about this. We're doing our best by all means. And when I say best, we've had to constantly remind ourselves throughout that as soon as we became aware of as many of the variables that we could, that there was no right way or no good way to make the many different decisions that we've had to make. Many times the decisions that we've arrived upon, and they haven't always been fully consensual or happy necessarily, have been to settle on the least bad decision because they all hurt. I'm sure that anyone listening to this, whether you be of American Indian or Indigenous heritage or not, can at least appreciate the pain and the anguish associated with becoming aware of the circumstances. For those of us on the committee that are of American Indian descent, I know I can speak for Commissioner Davis as well, that we are all Northern Plains American Indian tribal members. And when we became aware of the locations, and those of which we know, from which the ancestors came from, you suddenly begin to realize, knowing where your own family and tribes came from, that it's highly likely that those are your ancestors. And like I said, that's hard. It's been hard to maintain the confidentiality. And I'm trained to maintain confidentiality as a psychologist, and it's been excruciating to be only able after all these months to be able to share it with you. So I hope folks will appreciate that. As I touched on earlier, my primary responsibility to the committee is to lend a mental health response similar to this new flood that we're facing in terms of disaster mental health response. And those details are certainly available on our website. And our primary concern has been our American Indian students and their families and allies, as well as certainly our American Indian faculty, staff, and families and allies, by all means. And I will end with that and thank everyone for their concern and pray for our continued healing, because there's still a lot of work to do to bring the ancestors home.
Bonjour. As you heard previously from President Armacost, my name is Nathan Davis, and I serve currently as the Executive Director of Indian Affairs here in the state of North Dakota. I'm an enrolled member that was born and raised in the Turtle Mountains. My mother's family is Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and my father's family is Minwakan Oyate from the Spirit Lake Nation. Receiving this news about our ancestors, I can imagine, is not easy for anyone that's listening, anyone that has been having these conversations the last few days. It wasn't easy for me, nor was it something I ever expected to come across my desk with the position that I currently hold. And I will say what hit me really hard was, as a Native man, our job is to protect the younger generations, our life givers, and to bestow them teachings that will carry them into the future. And along with that, our job is to protect our teachings, to protect our Gitche Anishinaabe, our elders, and to honor our ancestors and protect them as well. My initial reaction, as you heard, was very similar to a lot of the other relatives that have heard this news recently. First, it was shock, it was disbelief. And I want to say, those that know me will probably understand this. It was the first time in my life that I was speechless. That's not something that really ever happens to me. But that feeling of shock and disbelief soon gave way to confusion and to anger. And in the teachings that I received in my life from my elders, from my ancestors, all I could do was go home and pray. I prayed for our ancestors, and I hoped that they would find peace in this process, as that was the first I had heard of it. And I will say that in our way, in our culture, and anything that I was taught, when one of our loved ones passes on, they are mourned over, they are prayed over, and there is ceremony for them to begin their journey. And once we put them in the ground and they become one with our mother, that is where they are to stay. There's nothing that I've ever been taught as a Native American man to put my relatives back in the ground. It violates who we are, that violates our culture. So when we say this hurts, it's because it touches our soul, it touches our spirit. Because in our ways, this is not supposed to happen. Our loved ones are supposed to rest. Immediately following my initial visit with President Armacost and Ms. Lyons, I had to take a few moments to get myself together. And I will say that in my position, being afforded the luxury of letting my personal feelings come to the surface is not something that happens regularly. No matter what happens, we have a job to do. I have a duty to carry out on behalf of my people and on behalf of the state of North Dakota. So I immediately scheduled a follow-up meeting with Governor Burgum. And immediately following those conversations, I facilitated yet another follow-up meeting that included President Armacost and Ms. Lyons. And I will say, through those conversations, my direct boss, which would be Governor Burgum, was very fired up He takes tribal engagement to the utmost importance, and he understands the need for mutual respect and understanding with our tribal partners in which we share geography with. But following those meetings, we had private conversations. And I will say that he allowed me to be open. He allowed me to be honest. And I will say that I was not only speaking with a boss at that moment, but a friend. And per those conversations, he understood that as the state of North Dakota, we need to stand by as a partner and honor the work that is now happening here in the University of North Dakota. And for his understanding and his respect, I will be forever grateful, because he truly understood what this will mean to my relatives and to my family members, not only across North Dakota, but across the nation, as this news became public. And I will say that as terrible as this news has been, and how insensitive and inexcusable the treatment of our ancestors has been historically in the name of science, because that's what this boils down to. That's always the excuse. And I will say this as a Native man, as Nathan Davis, science can no longer be an excuse from preventing our ancestors from returning home. I would personally like to commend President Armacost for his leadership in these hard times. He could have tried to sweep us under the rug, but he stood up and accepted full responsibility for what is now happening here at the University of North Dakota. And I will take it one step further and say what truly meant the world to me is that he brought in Native American staff and Native American faculty to lead these efforts. He understood that this was not his area. He understood the need for respect, for understanding, for cultural appropriateness, to make sure that tribes were not an afterthought in this process, as historically we have been. And so to him and to his team, I say miigwech. The work that happens here will honor our ancestors, and that's our duty to honor them. No matter how hard this is, no matter how much it hurts, how confused we are, how angry we are, we have to stand up and we have to honor our ancestors and make sure that they return home. And I will say we have a very unique opportunity to honor them by changing the way that not only North Dakota, but the United States itself approaches repatriation. Because we all know that sadly, this work is far from over. And to all of you that have had experience with this, you'll know what I'm saying. And one of the hardest issues of this, now just speaking personally, is one of the follow-up meetings that I had to facilitate was with a group of individuals that I consider my mentors, people that I grew up around. I was a very young elected tribal leader. And so I sat around with these great men in many meetings around many tables. And I learned from each one of them individually how they approached the situation, their speaking style, their demeanor. I took pieces of each of them as I grew around them and kind of molded into my own style. And I will say that without warning, I brought this to their table. And we say in our culture, we get every meeting in a good way, a good heart, because not a lot of meetings are easy, but we make sure that there's humor and we make sure that we come away with a mutual understanding. But that day was probably one of the hardest days I've ever had in my professional career, is seeing the look on the faces of the men that I admire, the men that I look up to, my leaders, my relatives, as they were hurt and they were confused. And they have a running joke now that was the first time I ever came to see them that I didn't try to stick around for lunch. So if they're listening, they'll understand that joke. And as we begin the process of speaking with Indigenous staff and faculty, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of anger as well. And we know that there's going to be insensitivity. There's going to be some hurtful opinions that surface due to this news being released. And to all Native Americans, I will say, no matter how hard things get, now is not the time to hide who we are. Today is not that day. Yesterday was not that day, nor will tomorrow be that day. We have to stand up and we have to do what's right by our ancestors. We have to rely on our culture and our teachings to carry us through these hard times. And with that, I say, miigwech.
With our remaining time today, we will open the floor to media questions of the panel. If you have a question for our panelists, go ahead and use the raise hand function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I can call on you and unmute your mic so you can ask your question and any follow-ups you might have. We have reserved this time for members of our media. So if you are a non-media member of our audience, we appreciate your attendance, but respectfully ask if you can yield the Q&A session to members of the media. To the members of the media, if you would please state your name and news outlet that you represent, and then ask your question, that would be great. With that, the Q&A session will begin momentarily. Okay, our first question today is from Neil Carlson. Neil, go ahead and ask your question. I think you might be muted, Neil. All right, we're going to move on next to Sydney Mook of the Grand Forks Herald. Sydney, go ahead and ask your question.
I'm Sydney Mook with the Grand Forks Herald. I suppose these questions all kind of come together in one. I'm curious, where these sacred items and ancestors were found. Are we able to say, what building and what department would have been in charge of them? Kind of who would have been responsible for overseeing them?
Well, as far as specific locations, we prefer not to release the details of where on campus they were or where they are currently. There were multiple locations, and through the support of tribal representatives, recently in August, we moved the ancestors and the sacred items to a single location on the campus. But in the interest of keeping that work private, I think it's important not to talk about the details of those locations. As to the question, I think that was implied by who was responsible. Ultimately, I'm responsible. Part of the work, as I mentioned earlier, is tracing what happened and how we would make such a discovery almost in plain sight of these sacred artifacts and ancestors. And so our immediate goal is to repatriate the ancestors and sacred items to the tribal nations as soon as possible. I'll call it a second order area that we're looking at is the lineage of responsibility and how did this happen? And that will require significant conversations with people involved in this work and carefully looking at archived records to piece together that puzzle. But what I can do is offer my assurance that now that these items are in our control and we know them to be in our control, we will take full responsibility for making sure repatriation happens as quickly as possible.
We're now going to move to a question from KVRR News. Go ahead, KVRR.
Hello, this is Austin Erickson from KVRR News. I'm curious why it took 6 months to tell the public what was going on, what happened. Also, I'm wondering why this press conference is not being live streamed on social media or the UND website. Some may think that the university is trying to hide this conference from the public. Thank you.
Right. Let me first address the timing. Since finding the ancestors and sacred items in the end of February and early March, we began immediately working with tribal representatives. We felt, the committee felt, and I felt the best way to do that was without the specter of public scrutiny at that point. Our intent was as soon as possible to make sure that the campus and the public were aware of this important activity. I mentioned earlier that we had a group of tribal representatives on campus early in August, and this was actually the subject of some conversation during that visit. Upon reflecting upon those conversations, we decided it was appropriate now to make this announcement. This was absolutely not a case of the university hiding a single thing. In fact, I'm proud of this committee and I'm proud of the work that we've done to work closely in partnership. And as our executive director for Indian Affairs just said, the way that we built these relationships represents, we believe, something atypical of the typical process that happens with repatriation. So building those relationships and following the leads of these tribal representatives was our first and most important priority. And expressing our apologies and our commitment to see this through to the very end was our top priority as well. The fact that it took us 6 months to get here, we went as fast as humanly possible, speaking with as many people as we could to get to this point. So there is no interest or intent on hiding this. We're as public as possible. I don't know about the technology and Facebook Live. I think this is being recorded, and if it is, I'm getting nods. We will post it proudly on the UND website for everybody to see.
Next, we will move to a question from Colby Kicking Woman. Go ahead, Colby.
Hello, Colby Kicking Woman with ICT, formerly Indian Country Today. You talked about being a model for other universities and museums in North Dakota and across the country. Are you aware of, or has anybody reached out to you either within the state or across the country about forming their own committees or how to go about searching their own institutions?
I lost a couple words. The speaker was a little shaky, but we are having conversations. I think I got the gist of your question. We are having conversations both at the state level and at the federal level about the process that we're taking and sharing openly the steps that the committee has taken and the engagement that we've had with the tribal leaders and the tribal communities. And so in speaking with some of those leaders, they often talk about the shortcomings of existing laws and perhaps the work that we're doing and hopefully the work of others will follow suit and place the tribes first in the process. And that if that can serve as an example to changes to federal or state law, I think that's a very good thing.
Mr. President.
No.
Next, we're going to welcome a question from Jackie. Oh, sorry.
We have another answer to that question.
I'd like to follow up to that question. It's been a real important aspect of the decision-making that the committee has made, especially given the context that we were blindsided by this, and this literally came out of nowhere. And we don't want other universities or other organizations to have to do what we've had to do, which is essentially scramble from scratch, try to pull together appropriate expertise, try to work with tribes and be as respectful as possible. And so it's been a priority for us to be able to not only be transparent, but also to document and record our efforts so that we might be able to be helpful to other organizations that also get blindsided by these set of circumstances. That's been important to us.
Jackie from the Bismarck Tribune, go ahead.
Hi, this is Jackie Jackson with the Bismarck Tribune. So, as you begin the repatriation process, have you been able to confirm if any of the remains or objects originate from Standing Rock or Fort Berthold?
I mentioned earlier that our first step was to respectfully place the ancestors and the sacred artifacts into a single location so that the work of repatriation could begin in earnest. At this point, we do have a very limited inventory. It's an incomplete inventory, and I think it's important to wait until we go through the process of identifying any connection of ancestors to specific locations until we have specific information that points us in that direction.
And I'll add that because we are at the beginning of this process, it's very hard to determine certain things such as where are they from, how did they get here, stuff like that. So again, there's not complete inventory. We will be starting from scratch.
Next, we have Dan Gunderson from Minnesota Public Radio. Go ahead, Dan. Dan, you may be on mute. I'm not sure.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We need your volume up a little bit, Dan.
Okay, is that better?
Better.
All right. So there was an inventory completion notice in the Federal Register back in 2001 with ancestors and remains found at the University of North Dakota. Is there any connection between that and this situation? Have those been repatriated? What's the process?
As we noted, as I noted in my opening comments, there is evidence that some repatriation has happened previously at the University of North Dakota. Any specific connection of ancestors or sacred items that we currently have on campus, the connection to previously repatriated items is not fully known at this point. This is part of the important work that's going to happen as we begin the repatriation activities.
Next, we'll go to Diane. Diane, can you state your full name and the media outlet you represent?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Diane.
Good afternoon. My name is Diane DeRosier, and I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate in northeastern South Dakota. Our tribe and our office has been consulting on this process. And my comment is that I just would like to reiterate what President Armacost has said earlier. The tribes wanted this to be kept confidential for as long as possible until we could make a determination on what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. Because of the nature of this situation, we take it very seriously, and it's a very sensitive situation, and we wanted to treat it as such. So it was never the university not talking about it, because they reached out immediately to the tribes, to every tribe that they could, to discuss what the discovery of the remains and where we go from here. So I'm speaking for Sisseton Wahpeton, and I have to say that we did ask that it be kept confidential for as long as possible. And so I appreciate and thank the university for honoring that for as long as we could. And so that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Ann. We're going to move now back to Sydney Mook for a follow-up question from the Grand Forks Herald.
Sydney.
Oops. Sorry about that, Sydney. I muted you.
Hello again, Sydney Milk with the Grand Forks Herald. I'm curious if you guys know if there would be any kind of legal action or whatnot for. I'm not sure if it would technically be failure to abide by the federal law that President Armacost had mentioned earlier, or how that would exactly work. Would there be anything related with that law?
So the question was, were there any legal repercussions for how we've done this? In speaking with the NAGPRA program manager the other morning, there was no indication other than appreciation for the steps that we're currently taking to do this repatriation. So there are provisions in NAGPRA about both criminal and civil penalties. And you can look that up online. It's pretty readily available. And our belief, at least as we've seen in the discussions we have, those provisions are not triggered by the steps that we've taken. But of course, this will be a long process as well. I know that at least in the current situation, I've been told that since we've discovered the items on campus, the ancestors and the items on campus, we need to make sure that we repatriate within 2 years of that finding. And that's what I was informed of earlier this week. So to answer your question, I don't believe there's criminal or civil penalties that will be issued to us.
Back to you, Jackie, from the Bismarck Tribune.
Oh, no, I didn't have any other questions, but thank you.
Apologies.
Dave, let me go back to just a little more to Sydney Mook's question. Even if we knew we'd be hit with penalties, we would do exactly what we've done. It wouldn't dissuade us from coming forward with the mistakes that we've made. This is too important, and we owe it to the tribes to make sure we bring their ancestors home. And I think that's an important point. So, so even though I speculate that there isn't any penalty, that is absolutely not the reason we came forward. We would have come forward anyway.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
I would add to that early on in this process, as the committee in discussions with President Armacost contemplated the path forward, we were, of course, aware of the policies, the laws governing and being in compliance or not with NAGPRA and other laws. And the committee made a very adamant stance that even if, just as the president has suggested, even if the letter of the law suggested that we needed to pull everything together, inventory it, as Ms. Lyons suggested that Harvard and other universities have, and then lay it on the table and say, there you go, tribes, come and get it. We weren't going to do it that way. We made the decision that even if there were going to be penalties, our approach was, as Diane suggested earlier from Siston Wahpeton, we were going to include the tribes from the very beginning, the elders, the healers, to help guide us in this process. And if that seemed backwards to some, we did it anyway.
Colby, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, Colby Kicking Woman with ICT. Do you expect any, or what kind of response do you expect from Native students? And can you talk about the resources that you are going to provide for them?
So after our discussion with our Indigenous community students yesterday, there was anger and there was devastation. And we talked through it, and there's still anger and there's still devastation, and that's okay. They deserve to feel that way. Not deserve, but they can feel that way, and that's okay. We've all felt that way. Do we anticipate certain actions? Maybe, but that's their right. They have every right to do what they need to do with their emotions. I think Doug can speak on the different things we have set up for them.
Right, and there's certainly greater detail will be on the website, but we have American Indian faculty and staff that are available at the American Indian Center, whose numbers and offices have been made available to the students if they just need immediate support. We've also assembled a team. I've assembled a team of doctoral students from the psychology department, native doctoral students from the psychology department, as well as native psychologists that are able to respond more in depth if students, faculty, or staff need to. We're there and have a mechanism to be able to respond to them.
I'll also add, I'd be more worried if our students didn't feel anything, because that just means that you're tired, you're done, and you no longer care. So the fact that they did feel anger and sadness, that means they still care. They care about our people, they care about our ancestors, they care about each other, and that's important.
We had a question in an earlier session today from a student, actually, that I think highlights this perfectly, along the lines of how can you in good conscience have kept this from us so long? We feel betrayed. And my response was, there's not much about any of this that the committee has dealt with, that President Armacost has dealt with and processed that we can come away and say was in good conscience. There's a lot that we probably have made mistakes and will learn from. And as I suggested earlier, we many times have been left with making the least bad choice of many potentially worse choices. And that student, like all the students, like every American Indian person listening, has every right, as Lane says, to feel betrayed, because we were. So it's understandable, and their feelings are legitimate, and we understand that.
And I need to add to it, but add one other dimension to this. These students are hurting. Our faculty and staff are hurting. And we will give them all the support that we can. But I also ask that there's a recognition for those who are going to engage the students to recognize they are hurting.
Yeah.
And this is a time, this is in the immediate aftermath. This is within 24 hours of them getting devastating news. And I know there's a tendency to want to reach out to ask them about how they feel. I think it's well known how they feel. And all I ask is that consider not engaging our students on this issue because of the pain that they're in. I recognize there are rights to a free press, and I fully respect that. And if you do engage, I ask that you approach them in a civil and respectful way. Something to the effect of, would it be okay if I asked you a question? I personally would prefer that you didn't do that, because students will come to you. They will come to you in due time, I can guarantee it, because the news that they've just received will not sit well with them, and they will engage the press openly. All I ask is for your respect and for them to have an opportunity to grieve. But again, if you do engage, please do it in the most respectful and appropriate manner. Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 more questions on the docket. We'll listen to those questions and then we'll let Dr. Armacost make a closing statement before we sign off. KVRR, Austin, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Austin Erickson, KVRR News. Is there any indication that the remains were being used for study or, God forbid, experiments? What is there any idea what they were being used for, or were they just being stored?
This is one of the questions that we have as well. How were these ancestors or sacred items being used? I think we'll get more information as we continue our study and the repatriation work, whether there's evidence of handling of these items, or is there documentation in notes, field notes about how they were used. We'll have a much clearer picture in due time. I can tell you that we know that some of the ancestral remains were likely used as teaching aids in some courses. We have, I think, direct either observation of this, but likely unknowing to the people who were handling them. Again, this is something that we take seriously, and we'll create the complete picture and be able to answer that question much better as we, and again, I have to emphasize this. We pledge to share information as we get it at appropriate intervals to make sure that both the campus and the general public are aware of what's happening. But we'll get the complete picture in due time as we conduct this analysis.
Next, we'll move to a question from Douglas. Go ahead, Douglas. You might be still muted, Douglas, if you want to hit your mute button.
Yeah, I think I got it. How you doing?
Good. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, President Armacost. How you doing? I see the whole team is on there. I don't know if any other tribal leaders are on or made any comments in regards to the situation at hand. But I would just like to acknowledge, President Armacost and Lane and Doug and Indian Affairs Commissioner Davis. When this was brought to their attention, I was glad that President brought it immediately to the tribal chair's attention, and traveled all the way to Bismarck, matter of fact. And as devastating as something like this type of news, along with all the other things going on regarding our missing and murdered women, our missing and murdered people, our residential children, this was quite another shocker, let alone something like this that had been going on, 90 miles down the road from us, Spirit Lake here in North Dakota. And then for the amount of time that this had went on, for I don't know how many years, but how many faculty we had there, how many students who went several years of school there, Native students in general, and then to not be aware of it, and then all of a sudden this, comes to the table. And I think a lot of us too, as older adults and as tribal leaders, we kind of felt the same, or kind of had the same ideas or thoughts as to how the students were going to feel. And naturally that first emotion is anger, but I think, for us that understand, because we're going through this a lot more recently, with residential schools, and we even have some potential studies to be done here locally at the old Fort Totten historic site, the square, the old mission school area, and then other surrounding areas of, searching for remains. But for something like this to happen at a pristine university was kind of really shocking. But I have to say, President Armacost, immediately brought this to our attention, where how many presidents before him knew about this and never did bring it to our attention. So we are grateful for that, and from here on, we have to try to address and take care of the relatives the best way we know how, between, the tribes of North, South Minnesota, because as stated earlier, we don't really know specifically whose relatives they are. So it's going to take a little bit of time and understanding. And I hope, the younger students there, will be able to understand this, as to the university and the tribes being able to address this and put those relatives to rest, the proper way that it should be done. And even as tribal leaders, we have to reach out to our spiritual leaders, because we don't know that process either. So we have to get the guidance from Siston Wapton, MHA, Red Lake, Cass Lake, whoever, and all come together and try to do the best we can. But I just, not picking sides or anything, but I just like to acknowledge that, President Amakas, immediately brought it to our attention. And I can't speak for the other tribal leaders, and I don't know if they're on, but, we just need to try to handle this the best way we can and support those, who are struggling with the situation at hand.
Thanks for your comment, Douglas. We're going to move real quick to Diane, and then we can let the panel have any closing comments, and let Dr. Armacost wrap up the news conference for the day. Go ahead, Diane.
Hello, this is Tamara St. John. I'm on Diane's computer. And I want to comment, first of all, in listening to this, that the president is really making statements that reflect the feelings of the tribes through the consultation that has already happened. And this is really geared towards the students. And I realize that this, of course, first reaction would be very shocking, but probably what others may not know surrounding this is what our processes and protocols are, and even how we address that part within our community, within our children. And we have those protocols, and this would be a good opportunity to educate and maybe experience, so that instead of just leaving them with the anger and devastation, and we want to be sure that we're not just by just acknowledging that, perpetuating that. We want to be able to promote the healing and show them how to move forward. And for us, we have the sort of processes and people, for example, like our traditional societies, our Buffalo Heart women, our Kit Fox, our veterans, our spiritual leaders, all of those. And we work very closely with Spirit Lake and other tribes to do those things. And these are things that, it may not be apparent now at this phase, but they are going to happen. Those are things that I believe are going to be really important for those students and for everybody else, for that matter. I know that.
I'm sorry, I muted you there. Can we get that back?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure where I was muted at.
That was me. Go ahead.
Okay, what I'm saying is I don't know at what point I was muted. I don't want to repeat the whole thing, but I'll just briefly reiterate that those processes for repatriation are what are going to help to promote healing for those students, instead of just perpetuating the devastation and anger and those sort of feelings. So I'm very pleased with the president and hearing the things that, and I hope the media will acknowledge that. when you have statements from Chairman Yankton, as well as Diane DeRosier, anthropologist and THPO officer, that, you know, we're very appreciative of the Mr. Davis's office reaching out right away, the work that has gone on. There's more to do. This isn't, you know, this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to do to refine involvement, and but there has been, it may not appear that way to others looking at this, but there have been communications and things going on. It's specifically the wish of the tribes to have that period of privacy. And we use the example of just much like as if any relative died, you know, you have that respect the family's privacy. So that's what's happening, not so much the idea that the university isn't wanting to be forthcoming. It's really the request of the tribes to honor those sort of protocols and allow us the time to really develop what will take place. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your valuable comments and perspective. With that, I will now let Dr. Armacost bring us to a close this afternoon.
Well, I thank all those who participated today. Hopefully this sheds light and gives information about the important and tragic findings on our campus. And I think the most, as I said to open my comments, the most important thing I can do as the university president is to express my apologies to our Native American colleagues, friends, the tribal communities for the mistakes that were made here at UND. In addition, we pledge to continuing our philosophy of putting the tribal nations first in the way that we think about our approach to repatriation. And then finally, is our commitment to seeing this work through to the very end. We owe that to the ancestors. We owe that to the tribal nations as well. Thank you all for joining us.